Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and I guess good evening to some of you who are logging in from around the world. We're just going to take a moment here to let the room fill up, seeing attendees starting to be added here. So we'll get going in just a moment. It's always the virtual equivalent of people coming in and taking their seats, as seeing the attendee numbers slowly starting to tick up. I think we have about 60 participants that'll be joining us today, and we will get started here. Looks like we've got a pretty good quorum here. So I am Laura Maguire, and I coordinate many of the Resilience Engineering Association webinars, and on occasion I have the good fortune to get to host them as well. I'm particularly excited about today's topic because I spent several years studying adaptations during incident response in critical digital infrastructure, and really looking at many of the ways in which software engineers are rising to the challenge of handling the COVID-19 disruption is really quite an extension of the strategies that I saw in many of my research. So I'm excited to get us going. Before I introduce our panelists, there's a few standard housekeeping items. First of all, the talk is being recorded. So of course, to optimize the audio quality, all your microphones have been muted. We did open up a submission form for questions, and we'll start off with those. But the intent with the discussion here today is to have this be very interactive, and I do want to encourage you to ask questions during the session. So you should have Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen, and so I'll be monitoring and selecting the questions from there. If you do have a chance to ask the question, I'll unmute your microphone so that you can ask directly to the panelists. After the seminar, this session will be freely available to the public on the REA website, but slide decks are only available if you become a member of the Resilience Engineering Association. So it's a small contribution. It really helps us to continue some of these efforts that you see here today. And our panelist here today is a group of internationally recognized experts in both resilience and software engineering. We have, first off, John Allspaw, who has worked in software systems engineering and operations for over 20 years in many different environments, including as the CTO of Etsy. He's published several books and chapters, and you can find many of his enlightening and entertaining conference talks across the internet. He holds a master's in human factors and systems safety in Lund University. So welcome, John. Our second panelist is Nora Jones. She's a software engineer who's previously worked with Netflix, Slack, and Jet.com, and she is the co-founder and CEO of Jelly.io. She has co-authored 2 books on chaos engineering, and she also presents internationally on chaos, on resilience, and learning from incidents. And last but definitely not least is Dr. Richard Cook. He is a research scientist, a physician, and a real pioneer in resilience engineering for safety in complex risk critical worlds. He is the author of the seminal paper, which no doubt many of you have read, How Complex Systems Fail, and amongst other books, Behind Human Error. He's currently a research scientist at the Department of Integrated Systems Engineering at Ohio State, and he's an emeritus professor of healthcare systems safety in Sweden's KTH. So welcome to all of you. To kick us off here today, I wanted to just kind of set the tone with some stories. I wanted to hear about some anecdotes that to you are really reflective of the kinds of responses that software engineering and software engineers have had to COVID-19. So I'd like to start with you, John.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a couple of stories come to mind. Most of the interesting stories end up being about with organizations that I've spoken with or organizations that we've worked with, that Richard and I have worked with in our work. Involves so organizations that have considered themselves so software-centered organizations that consider themselves very remote-friendly or remote-first, or certainly who has a leg up in setting up the sort of the infrastructure and the norms and sort of the practices that help it manage work across lots of time zones and people outside of a physical office. Now, the interesting thing is that those groups it seems as if were doing that quite well pre-pandemic, but what the pandemic did was changed. It's not that they did everything. Oh yeah, we're just going to keep doing the thing that we're doing. They had to adapt as well, because most of those practices and all the infrastructure that sort of set up that they were quite good at involved a world where the engineer or the person the staff member, was largely working from home by themselves, not with a house full of kids or a bunch of pets or in-laws, cousins, and that sort of thing. And so, so those adaptations, so there are some cases where companies that you would think, oh my God, this company X, oh my God, they're great at this. Everybody knows that they're great at this, and they're slowing some things down, or they're not, they're making some changes as a result. The other is that in other organizations, regardless of whether they were sort of set up to handle remote work, it tended to, in some cases, just postpone indefinitely some projects and accelerate other projects. So there are some, quote unquote, there are some organizations where whatever the legacy platform of the month or the quarter or the year or so, we're going to move away from this. One day we're going to move away from insert antiquated sort of technology here. And it's not that it wasn't on the roadmap, but it wasn't, oh my God, if we don't do this now, we're going to be in worse shape. And that's for various reasons. Either they've got they have the people who have been supporting that legacy. Some I've heard it called heritage technology. They may be in a region or market like New York early on that were in tough shape, and they didn't have a lot of time to devote. So they thought, oh, we got to get this sort of shored up sooner rather than later. For the most part, I mean, without naming specific companies, I would say that the thing that they all have in common is these adaptations were all surprising. They didn't expect that even after a month or so, they think, yeah, you know what, we're going to do a project. There's been companies where we, Richard and myself at ACL, had set up to be doing a project, and it was intended to be done on site. And they said, oh, well, no, we're gonna wait. We're gonna wait on this. And then some time passed, and they came back and said, yeah, so maybe we're not gonna wait. Maybe we'll try doing it remotely. So those are some. I'd be surprised if people had differing versions of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that consistent with what you're seeing, Nora?
Yeah, I mean, so I think everyone had a different interpretation of the adaptations when we were in the beginning of this. I think some companies at the beginning were telling, business as usual, and we're just going to keep working on our projects as usual. And then I think we hit a point sometime in the last month or so where the folks that had been a little bit behind on those realizations kind of came to a head and started saying, okay, we do have to reprioritize things, and we do understand folks are under duress at home. Their lives are different. I've seen, just from organizations I've talked to and colleagues I've talked to at different companies, they have absolutely had to take on new projects as a result of this, meaning that the other projects that they were working on before did end up getting deprioritized. And I think everyone's in a state now where they're still having to work on this new work that they've adapted to while questioning what's going on with their other work. And I think some of the interesting things that we're seeing right now is like learning from incidents can actually be more important than ever, using it as a catalyst to actually see how you're working and see how you're doing and see if, you know, your expectations are matching reality here. It's a situation that none of us have been in before, that none of us can prepare for. And so using something like an incident as a catalyst to see how it's actually going and see how you can adapt and keep improving, I think is going to be really important here.
Right, it provides that sort of short cycle feedback loop to help you continue to adapt and adjust as conditions continue to change.
Yeah, exactly.
Richard Cook, your reflections on the on what you're seeing.
I mean, it's very hard to draw general conclusions because the impact has been so broad on so many fronts and affected both individuals and organizations. I would say that the thing that is in common is that no one knows what to expect. And because no one has been able to predict the future, everyone has become very concerned about doing things that preserve the ability to handle different kinds of futures. At a personal level, for people, this might mean things like cutting back on non-essential expenditures, or putting off a move into a house, or you know, planning something about changing the way in which they're planning some financial plans from being fairly long-term to being much shorter term. That's paralleled by the same kinds of activities that are happening in organizations. And in many ways, the organizations are being whipsawed both by uncertainty internally about what this means for their workforce and so forth, and uncertainty externally about what it means for the products that they are selling or the services that they're providing. They don't know what to predict. You know, Zoom is apparently, you know, been the zeitgeist holder here and been able to capitalize on this, but many other companies have not. And I think that the jury is still out on all of these companies. There's no company that I think can be assured of its future. And that includes the very large ones. You know, the Google, Amazon, Apple type companies are really very much uncertain about what's going to happen in the future and how this is going to play out. I think that the last couple of weeks reflect a kind of sea change. Even though we didn't find it particularly persuasive, there were many voices, particularly from Washington, D.C. and the administration, saying that everything was going to be over soon, that we were going to be back to some sort of normal, that we would recover, regain something, that this was somehow going to be an episode that was going to be followed by a rebound back into some kind of normal function. And a lot of groups, particularly state governments, local governments, but also other organizations, incorporated that idea into their planning, and they started to try and behave as though the single episode was now ending. And of course, they found out that the episode is not ended in any fashion. In fact, it's continuing. And I think this is a pretty profound shock now. In some ways, it's more profound than the first shock. The first shock had a feeling of you know, somewhat of a delayed 9/11 feeling. You know, oh, there's this tremendous hit. Everything is different. We've just suffered an enormous damage, and partly because it was all focused on New York. That, you know, there was that sense that this New York is the epicenter, and New York is having trouble, but the rest of us are sort of okay. And people lulled. I don't want to say lulled. That's the wrong word. People optimistically believed that they were going to be over this shortly. And the last 2 weeks have shown that that's not the case. And so I would expect that all planning is now once again up for grabs. Almost all corporate planning now has been undone by the last 2 weeks, because it is clear that we are not going to have a rapid return to some sort of, situation from before this all started. This is going to hang on for a very long time. And I think that that's a pretty profound blow to many people who had hoped that this was something, that they would weather like a hurricane or something and then be done with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that that kind of resonated with me and actually was one of our submitted questions was this idea of the adaptations that many of the organizations have made, shortening the planning timelines or in some cases deferring planning sort of altogether. As part, the submitted question that we had was, as part of the initial wave of COVID-19, a moratorium for deployments was put in place temporarily. However, that moratorium is still in place today in the questioner's organization. Nora, I'll ask you this first. Does that continued deployment moratorium really actually help with safety and reliability of the systems?
I think that's a question that companies are really going to have to look inward and ask themselves is what they're trying to solve with doing that and how it's going so far. Because eventually that's going, you are going to have to adapt and end that at some point, right? And so what that looks like might be different from how you're used to deploying in your environments typically. I think we will just have to, I think companies are going to have to face that in a relatively short order if they haven't already. I understand the reasoning behind why folks would go towards that as a means, when everything else is uncertain, let's just make this kind of certain. It makes sense from a rationalization perspective, but there's only so much of that you can do. And you do have to adapt at some point and make sure that you're setting your folks up with the right model to be able to get their jobs done. Ultimately, just putting more gates in place and putting more checks and balances in place isn't going to make things safer. It's just going to have people feel a little bit more gatekept. And so I think leaders really need to talk with their organizations too, rather than implementing some of these rules and procedures now that we have this, new world that we're in, and actually ask themselves if these rules and procedures that they're implementing are working and if folks are learning from them and how they can adapt them over time.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It is kind of, the conditions are going to dictate what the right action or inaction sort of is. John, Richard, is there some inherent brittleness in a code deployment moratorium?
You managed to get that question out with a straight face, Laura. Go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
No, John, after you.
This certainly isn't, I don't think this isn't COVID specific. The topic has happened, and the topic has been a sea of dialogue and conversation in the industry for what seemed like eons at this point. Yes, I mean, right. Nora's, I can't say anything that Nora didn't already say. I mean, there's so, what are they not able to do? What will they be able to do? These are questions that a moratorium on deployment and what's a deployment and what's different, I think it's, I think what we can feel very confident about is that absolutes, when it comes to software engineering, always find a way to boundary cases, edge cases. Yeah. You'll always be able to find a reason and a rationale to break the moratorium, in which case, sure, fine. But you got to do what Nora suggested. See how that's working for you.
And it's interesting, John, because, you know, when we see these deployment freezes around big things like a holiday where your traffic spikes up, right? It's kind of a known entity. It's a known period, but there's still a lot of unknowns around it. Every company I've been at has had some sort of code freeze, has had some sort of deployment freeze prior to the pandemic, right? And every single time there's been confusion. Literally every single time I've been part of a freeze of any sort, there's been confusion on what that means. And I haven't seen anyone actually take a look and see if it's helping us in some way, right? And so what I think is a lot different about this one that folks are putting a moratorium on is we don't know the end date of it. And so you're actually hurting yourselves and hurting your employees by implementing this, right? It's kind of this, it's this easy fix. That's kind of the first thing that comes to mind, but you need to revisit it super quickly.
Right. Yep.
I'm interested here from the attendees, if you can drop into the Q&A, how many of you have some degree of moratorium or of a code freeze going on? Do we have any other thoughts on that from our panelists?
I would just say that I think that this idea of freeze is a kind of binary thing that's, it's a bit that's on or off is incorrect. It's never been that way. There are no places that that truly freeze. Nobody does that. Everybody is still able to put into place corrections and other things. And there's no place that is constantly going at the same rate. The thing that we see over and over is that organizations are trying to adjust the rate at which they are bringing new product to market into their, or new components into their product, and also trying to build up the supporting architecture and so forth. And they're adjusting that all the time in response to what they think the vulnerabilities are and the amount of effort. That's a continuous adjustment. It's not an either or an on or off, except at the administrative, bureaucratic, senior servant level. The senior people in the company may imagine that they can say that. They may imagine that they can say, oh, we're going to freeze or something like that. They think of that as a button or a lever that they have on their dashboard that they can control. And that's a fundamentally mistaken idea that is actually quite dangerous. It's dangerous mostly because what you do then is you, as everybody's pointed out, you accumulate all sorts of backlog of change and difficulties responding. But even more than that, you draw attention to all sorts of problems so that you wouldn't have drawn attention to previously. Somebody is doing something and they did it in spite of the change, and now something bad happens and the axe falls on that person, even though they, what they were doing was essentially routine maintenance that looks like nothing. It doesn't look like a change at all. It looks like what we have to do to just keep the engine running. So I think maybe the idea of change here I liked what Scott said about this as freeze theater. I think it is theater, but for many people, the theater is quite real. And that's particularly true for senior execs who imagine that they have control and now are exerting it. And I think that's pretty hazardous because I don't think they have the control. They have the illusion of control.
If I could just add one thing, Richard already made the point. This situation that we're in with the pandemic is, on the one hand, feels like it's decades. And on the other hand, it's actually not, because things have been changing quite a bit. It's not actually a long period of time. So the quickness with which people who advocated for moratoriums may mistake correlation with causation. Right. And I think it's fundamentally, it's logically incongruent with the notion of productive action items, right? Productive action items are certainly intended to prevent incidents in the future. So how can you do work with action items to prevent incidents in the future if you can't touch the system? In which case, touching the system is intended to make less incidents. And so, when you say, well, we haven't had, we had a moratorium, we even had we had a code freeze during, Cyber Monday or Black Friday or whatever. And look, we didn't have any incidents. Well, I'm not sure what to do with that other than say that there might be a correlation there, but you need to also necessarily be open to the idea that there's not a causal link.
It's especially interesting for some companies, because at previous organizations I was at, we would do the freeze on Cyber Monday or those big holidays if that was a high traffic time period for the company I was at, because all eyes were on us. And so I think during the pandemic, there are certain companies that all eyes are on right now. Slack, Zoom, food delivery services, right? And so I'm definitely interested, I've heard a little bit from what those companies are doing, but I also think back to freezes I was at, for a specific period of time where all eyes were on the company. And so you didn't want a mistake during that time period. However, sometimes that time period would be a significant amount of time. At one organization I was at, that time period was a month. And so what do engineers do during that month? They build up a bunch of stuff to deploy. And so they get to the end of the month and they go to deploy it, and all those deployment muscles have atrophied. And stuff happens that wouldn't typically happen when you're practicing this all the time. I remember a very large incident occurred right after a deployment freeze at one company. And I had been interviewing someone afterwards, and they were like, I don't know why I did that particular thing. I never do that. And it was an interesting phenomenon to hear them say that afterwards, right? And so I think yes, maybe you might be having less incidents during that period, but you're delaying them. There's something else that's happening as a result too.
Yeah, in the comments we've seen, John Perry says, we learned years ago that the period after a freeze is filled with new problems. And John Benninghoff also said that, we've seen that it shifts the incidents in time until after the freeze as well.
I just think that Nora's point has to be emphasized here again, because it's the key idea, which is that this idea that we are doing something in anticipation of something that we know is a mistake. It's something that we don't know. And in some ways, this is playing out very much like the way the larger COVID response has played out. We're going to take dramatic action, but we can only do that for a certain period of time because there's all these other things that are going to happen. So we'll have to get back to normal, and we're coming back to normal, but we can't quite get back to normal because the world has changed underneath us. And so I think that there's a parallel between the way organizations are responding and what we see in other places. And the parallel is probably incorrect. They're connected. They're functionally connected. But this idea that we thought we were dealing with X when in fact we're dealing with Y is something that's over the last 2 weeks has really come home to people. They took a terrible hit in March and April. And in May, they took a terrible economic hit, and they thought, oh, I've suffered a terrible economic hit, but I'm a good healer and I'm getting my strength back and all the rest of that stuff, and I'll be back to normal. I'll be, as Rocky Raccoon said, I'll be a better doc as soon as I am able. But in fact, it's still coming. And so that idea was an incorrect one. And I think this is likely to undermine not only our ability to plan in the future, but our sense that our planning is meaningful. It's much harder to plan when you've just found out that all the plans that you just made turned out not to work very well. What is the next plan that you're going to produce, and how much confidence you're going to have in it? And I think that's going to be a pretty difficult thing. You can produce a lot of plans, but the problem here is that, and I think we'll get to this eventually, is that we can't do the static process of cyclical planning. We plan, we act, we go on forward, the world changes, we replan. The planning is now integrated into a continuous activity. We're not simply planning, we're always observing and responding what is happening around us. And that is feeding into and adjusting those plans continuously. And that's a very uncomfortable position to be in, especially if you're isolated up in the C-suite. You know, what does it mean to do that? We have no idea. We don't have any experience with that. And so I think that's where we're going to end up, is that people are, the companies that survive this will not be the companies that are good at planning. They'll be the companies that are good at understanding what's happening to them and adjusting in a dynamic, real-time way so that they're taking advantage of the opportunities that appear and being able to deflect or defend against the immediate and longer term risks that are cropping up that they didn't expect to see before. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned about the sort of paucity or lack of real consideration of what incidents are, because the most difficult thing is that for a lot of these places is they're having incidents, but they've never been in the practice of understanding them in any kind of deep way, because they've had a methodical, monotonous kind of quality. Oh, you fix this, we run for a while. You fix that, we run for a while. But companies are being whipsawed in ways now that are changing qualitatively the kinds of events that they're experiencing. And as a consequence, unless they find some way to explore these things and understand what they mean, they're going to be way, way behind the curve. And we already see that. It's amusing. John and I looked at one. We've had one big company talk about its resilience in response to COVID-19, and all the examples that they provided were not examples of resilience. They were all examples of essentially harvesting resources already present. And it just said that the company was running up in a largely wasteful way, and that when push came to shove, they could go out and grab a whole bunch of resources and reposition them, repoint them, and they could get through it. But they didn't think at all about what the resource drain was going to be, or the fact that they now no longer had those resources to mobilize. They're left completely naked.
Yeah, I think so. You've offered a number of kind of directions for leadership to sort of recognize what changes are needed or how to approach kind of the changing environment that they found them in. One of our submitted questions, Nora, John, if you want to expand on that, is like, how do you get that leadership to recognize what changes are needed when they haven't been in this situation before either?
So I thought Richard's comment was interesting about companies really haven't had the practice to learn from their incidents. What I'm also seeing a lot is I think the word incident can kind of scare folks sometimes in terms of learning from it, in terms of taking an actual good hard look at how you work, but it provides just that, an actual good hard look at how you're working and what's going well versus what you think is going well, and what's going poorly versus what you think is going poorly, and kind of gives you some insight on that. I think, if you're in an organization and you're trying to convince leadership to kind of take some of these hard, honest looks, use low risk examples. That's something that, I've learned from John and Richard in the past. And I think we're in an interesting time period because there has to be this form of change management that, unfortunately, as an employee, you have to do with leadership as well, right? Leadership's not going to immediately buy into taking a good hard look at things. And so you have to ease your organization into that. Use low risk things, use low risk learning experiences, and sort of iterate from there, rather than trying to change everything overnight. I thought what Richard was saying about planning is super interesting as well, because planning takes a long time. It feels good to say, here's the plan that we're setting out to. We're going to be working on this for X number of months. And then in the middle of those number of months, new things about the pandemic pop up. But your team is jiving, it's agreeing to this plan, it's executing it. And then there's more disruption that is, having you adapt to it. And I think part of that planning needs to come adaptability and, you know, accounting for yourself on how you're practicing that. And if you're able to take those good hard looks at things, even planning for that can be helpful too, especially between leadership and engineering.
John, did you have any thoughts to add to that as a former CTO?
Yeah, not really. I mean, if you believe that plans are anything that remotely feels like a promise about what the future looks like, then that's when you're in tough shape, right? It's going to be about it's keeping your eye about how far you are away from plans is different than keeping your eye on how far away from being able to adapt to and being able to change those plans without notice, right? And so, and that can be, you know, that can be really difficult, and it can be super unintuitive. Just like Richard said, you know, there are companies, most successful companies right now in COVID have adapted the way they work, have adapted their plans, have adapted, you know, they thought they were gonna, you know, spend some, you know, I'll say resources or sort of horsepower or energy or attention in this area. And they had a, you know, sort of a stock of attention or energy around this thing, and had to turn it and say, well, we're gonna have to turn. And so that ability to make those adaptations, if you think that it's going to be over and you have some idea, oh, it's maybe the fall will be over, then those adaptations feel like workarounds, right? Workarounds are, you know, you say, when you say workaround, you think, oh, there's this temporary thing until I can get a real thing to make it not a workaround, right? I think what people are finding is these aren't workarounds in the same way. They're adaptations. And maybe, yeah, the fact that you had the ability to adapt, that is the thing you should keep your eye on, not the adaptation itself, but the ability, how quickly you have been able to say, you know what, here's this project mumble, fuck it, we're not doing it, done, can't do it, we're not going to do it, we're not going to waste any time messing, you know, but wait, we talked about that on 3 earnings calls last year. And all the analysts said that we were going to go to, I don't care. It's either that or have the company go under. You had more slack than you expected. And the ability to redirect that capacity into productive ways means that you ought to keep your eye on that ability, right? Teams who were working on, you know, just infrastructure are now doing some UI work. Why? Because it expanded, or vice versa. Oh, turns out, you know, maybe not full stack, but you've got some, you've got some folks on your team that manages Kafka has some JavaScript skills. All right, great. And vice versa. Great, now you have a capacity. Now you've identified a thing because you had to. Name it, support it, so that you'll be able to adapt in the future. Yeah, I mean, that's what I think the adaptations, if I were CTO at a successful household name company, I would be paying attention to how the organization is getting work done despite what I am telling people to do.
Interesting. David has mentioned that he's an engineering director in New York City, and he mentioned that he was clear to folks that he was that they needed to take care of their needs first, and he understood that deadlines would slip. and his stance shifted from helping people move stuff quickly to attending to people's needs. And I think that sort of speaks to this idea that like this is the new normal. It's not sort of a temporary period. There are real long-term sort of implications for people both personally and professionally. This kind of brings us back a little bit to the start of the question, but it was another good question from David that I know all three of you have been talking to senior level people in different organizations, and he is interested in knowing what the process was like for organizations when they recognized that the situation they're in was unprecedented. He heard a lot of execs saying stuff in March and in April, like, oh, this is just like 2008, or we still remember 9/11. Richard, you made a comment about this being a sort of a qualitatively different space. Are you hearing from other leadership in the organizations that they have sort of been rocked back by how this is truly unprecedented?
Well, there's good news and there's bad news. I think that one of the things that's happened is that the flows of information about what's happening have not been very high quality. And that's common in periods where you have great change and tumultuous events, right? Information, it's not just that there's a shortage of information. The information is contradictory or conflicting, very often very noisy and really hard to make sense of. It's not widely and universally distributed, and people have trouble knowing what's going on. And you could take the testing and the case counts and those sorts of things as being a sort of model for that. And it doesn't work very well because for a variety of reasons, those don't provide us a clear enough picture. So I think many people are laboring in the darkness without a lot of clarity about what's going to happen. And they are very narrowly focused on their immediate goals and trying to preserve as many degrees of freedom as they possibly can for the future. I think that if you look at an example of the places that have been really badly hit would be hospitals. Hospitals have taken an enormous financial hit from this that has yet to appear broadly in the experience. That is, when they stopped taking in patients, they stopped generating revenue. Their costs didn't go down, and so they essentially burned through all of their reserves. Now, some of the big ones still have money, but many places have burned through huge amounts of their capital, trying to just sort of stay afloat. And that means that the range of possibilities that they have is very much limited. So what do? They lay off all their temporary employees, they lay off all of their occasional employees, they cut back on staffing, all the rest of these things, and they try to return to normal as quickly as possible because they need that revenue. They're jonesing for it. They're addicted to those operations happening every day, and if they don't get their operations every day, they go into withdrawal pretty bad. That's what's happening there. I think that similar things are happening in other places that may be a little less pronounced. I don't think that senior leaders are better calibrated about what the future holds than anybody else. I mean, I don't think they have a magic crystal ball that says this is how things are going to be. They're making it up as they go along. They're trying to project a strong feeling of competence and so on. But right now, I think our confidence in leadership is pretty low, and I don't think anybody expects that will be restored anytime soon. On the other hand, we've seen some really remarkable performances by individuals working at the coalface or the sharp end of the system. We've seen lots of people step up to do things, to volunteer in a variety of ways, to try and help out, as John pointed out, to step into areas that were outside their normal territory, to make adjustments in the way they do business and so on to try and cope with this. And so if you say, where is the adaptability in the organization? It's clearly not in the C-suite. The adaptability in the organization is at other levels. It's at mid-management level and at the front end level or the sharp end level. There's lots of adaptability there. And I guess if I were going to say, if we're going to talk to senior leaders about this, it would be mostly about trying to get them to understand the adaptations that people have had to make stuff work. That is, I don't think they are in touch enough with what's been going on to make the system work, that they really understand how valuable the adaptive capacity of those people in the sharp end and the middle of the company have been to their continued sustenance. They still imagine that this is just work as normal under slightly different conditions. And if I were going to have them do something, it would be go and find out what adaptations had to be made. Find out what things you now are in short supply on, and try and figure out who has been the best at making these adaptations, and ensure that those people are still with you going forward. And you know, this is, we were talking earlier about investing in resources. I think investing in resources is really important. The resources that matter are the ones that have provided the adaptability that's got you this far. And that's where your focus should be. And if I were going to advise senior executives about how to look at this or how to think of it, it wouldn't be so much about trying to, you know, crystal ball what the future is going to be like 6 months from now, because I think that's a fool's errand. But I think it would be an important time to look at the company and how it's dealing with things, understand the organization and what it's actually doing. What have we had to do? How many people have we burned out? Who had to leave? Who's been unavailable? Who went on sick because of the stress? Who did we lose because we couldn't? They had, you know, family matters that required their attention. They had to take family leave. How did we adapt to this failure over here? How did we adapt to this sudden change in demand over there? How did we actually accomplish all those things? And learn from that and reinforce that. Trying to predict, you know, are we going to have 20% growth or 10% growth in the third quarter or the fourth quarter? That seems to me to be, you know, kind of fantasy process. But understanding what has happened up till now, that's pretty concrete stuff.
Yeah, I think Yvonne made a comment earlier, sort of referring to that as well in terms of, you know, looking at these opportunities to work differently and to innovate. And it brings me to another question that was submitted. I personally believe that the current work context is the new normal, and I'm optimistic that the last 4 months have proven that companies already digitally inclined will accelerate their remote capabilities. COVID may put more pressure on mediocre or average companies while creating new opportunities for others. In the case of some really well-known retailers, they're using it as a catalyst to enhance retail capabilities such as omni-channel to create advantages versus their competition. Have you seen examples of graceful extensibility like this in other organizations? Nora or John?
I think we're seeing it all over the place. I mean, I think one thing that leaders really have to keep in mind during this is, yes, work is in flux, and yes, businesses are in flux, and there's so many changes we need to adapt to, but there's also all of the people that you work with at an organization are going through things individually that are so disruptive for them right now. And that adds to, you know, adaptability and change on the business's side too. And I think that's one thing that leaders really do need to look into right now is how they're helping people maintain their resilience, how they're helping their company maintain their resilience right now. And that, you know, includes asking different questions and taking different approaches than you have in the past. I think not doing that is definitely a big miss for folks right now. But yeah, I've seen it all over the place. I've seen a lot of really interesting things. I've seen organizations that have a lot of, you know, not invented here syndrome, where they have they build a lot of tools themselves. And so when you're in an organization like that, and all of a sudden everyone goes remote, and a lot of folks are now remote, the people that have to maintain those systems are now going to be put under much more duress than they had ever had before. And so I think a big form of that I've seen so far is some of those organizations, one, either staffing those up, or two, adjusting their tactics a little bit. Like, oh, maybe this thing that we have maintained for so long isn't super necessary for our business right now. Maybe we can look outside. And so I think things like that, like actually taking the ability to say, hey, yes, this was our plan all along, and this was our plan leading all the way up to this, but we're super different right now. And so let's take a step up and see if this still makes sense for us. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a clarifying function. That's a really good point. John, did you have any comments on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as the question submitted is concerned, I think, I mean, of course, the question is correct in that there are going to be some groups that actually have, perhaps surprisingly, runaway success, right? When it rains out, turns out the people selling umbrellas can be wildly successful. All right. I have heard that the Great Depression produced a lot of success in the paper industry because bureaucracy, counting things and tabulating who has what, created a need for paper that was unprecedented. And so to the case of, when in the case of sort of retailers, enhancing retail, omni-channel, that sort of thing, I guess, I mean, sure, I can absolutely see that, especially when, because it's a push comes to shove situation. But the fact that they have an ability to do that now meant that it's likely that they had an ability to do it before, but they had rationale for not doing it. And so that's the thing about an adaptation, in that the circumstances sometimes are, well, we can't do that because we just don't have, we don't have the resources. Well, actually, no, the thing is that you do have the resources. It's what you're choosing to prioritize at the moment, given the situation that you find yourself in. And so, I mean, I would say that any organization that is able to maintain a service, a software service, since the pandemic started, and hasn't seen a significant loss of staff or customers, is a signal that graceful extensibility was a capability in place long before the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. So we have just a couple of minutes left here. There's one more question that I wanted to ask. I know there are some folks on the call that aren't from software, but are interested in learning from software organizations. Richard has asked, what can older or more traditional organizations, manufacturing, public transport, for example, learn from leading software development organizations? Are there some types of businesses designed for adaptability and resilience, or is this a myth or an oversimplification?
I don't think that we design organizations in the kind of sense that we design other things. I think organizations are organic things that grow and develop along various lines, and we might influence them in one way or another, but we don't get to sit down and make them up unless you're talking about, some sort of Stafford beer, Brasilia kind of monstrosity, or Chilean monstrosity. The advantage of software has largely been its ability to use and develop things that scale very rapidly and have low human touch in them, so that you can distribute them widely and people can use them very easily. In some ways, it's a bit of a myth, because when we look at those systems, we actually find that people need to have lots of experience to use them, need to have lots of skill and expertise in making them go. It's a much more nuanced picture than most people outside the industry would probably think of it. And so I think that I guess I would say that the manufacturing and transportation people would be justified in saying, in understanding that the software industry is experiencing many of the same problems, perhaps at a very high rate, and not necessarily coping with them all that much better than any other organization is. When you have companies that have enormous capital investments, like an aviation industry or something like that, their biggest problem that in the short run that they face is essentially a financial one. They see themselves with a financial problem. They have to pay the interest on the debt that they have. They're not flying. There's no money coming in. They face immediate cash flow problems, all the rest of that stuff. Well, guess what? So do software companies, and they have a similar sorts of experiences. I think about the resilience, though, that I think that one thing that's difficult here is that the ability to learn when under stress is not something well developed in a lot of places. And if we want to find out where learning takes place when things are really bad, I think we have to look perhaps in some other areas. You can look at military organizations in periods of battle, especially long sustained operations, where they have to learn very quickly. And if you were to want to read something, I think Anthony Cordesman's The Lessons of Modern Warfare, particularly the book about the Russians in Afghanistan and their learning, is a good example of this, where people were faced with failure and learned, because they were dedicated to learning, learned very, very quickly how to respond. And they became entirely focused on learning, and that's what brought them through this. And I think that's going to prove to be very important as we go forward in the future here. No one can tell you what's going to happen. People who pretend to tell you, people who are pretending to tell you what are just pretending. And so what you need to do is put yourself in the frame of, how can I learn at a rate that is high enough from the experiences that we are now having that we can make the kind of adjustments that we need to make. If I were going to give you an imperative, it's to invest heavily in learning from what's happening right now. You need to invest more in learning. It's not just about response and resources, it's about investing in the learning.
Great. So that's a good sort of closing comments there. We are coming up to the end of the hour. Nora, I know you have a hard stop here at noon, so I wanted to give you a chance for any kind of closing comments or reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Richard said right now. We have no way to predict what's going to happen. And so being able to be flexible and adaptable is so important to not only our businesses, but like our team structure and team health, and retain employees, and making sure, we have sustainable businesses going forward. Like, we have to constantly be looking at these things. We have to constantly be retrospecting, week over week. And it can be daunting, especially when you're not practiced at learning from these things and don't exactly know what that means, right? What structure do you set up? I think a lot of these organizations are just unpracticed at it. And I think this group, the Resilience Engineering Association, folks in learning from incidents communities and software can really help guide the industry here in showing them these resources and getting started with learning techniques. I think it can be overwhelming from a number of different perspectives, but I think it's sometimes folks don't totally like what they find or know what to do with it. And you have to kind of be comfortable with that to an extent. So that's my definite closing thought right now.
Nice, thank you. And thank you for your time. If you have to hop off, feel free. John, really quick closing comments.
My closing comment is to rewind the video and listen to exactly what Nora said again.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much for your time and your insights here today. Thank you to all our participants for the questions and the interactions. That was fantastic. As I mentioned, we will post this recording here on the REA website very shortly. Next up, we typically take a little bit of a break for the summertime, but we'll have some graduate student resilience engineering projects over July and August. And then in the third week of August, we've got a maritime shipping responses to COVID-19 as well. So stay tuned, resilience and engineering association.org /seminars. We'll give you registrations to all of those once they get posted. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you again next time.